to our economic undercard. Forbes media chairman and former Republican presidential candidate Steve Forbes and former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama, Austan Goolsbee. Good to have you both, gentlemen. All right. Steve, the Democrats have brought their original $3.3 trillion offer down to $2.2 trillion. Well, you know, the numbers are kind of moving, but the White House has moved its offer up to $1.88 trillion. What should be the president's next move, and is he handling this correctly?
Well, I think what he should do is get to the specifics. One is there's going to be no bailout of states that have mismanaged their finances. But having something like a big paycheck, the round of checks, instead of $1,200, make it $2,000 and the like. And on the payroll tax, suspend that for 6 months so people know they can get more money and employers know they can hire people and save money. Win-win all around. If you have those kind of positive things, that would be a good stimulus package.
Austan, all right, so Steve says we do need detail. I think the American people always deserve detail. It's their money. But in my opinion, stimulus is a misnomer. It should be called a life raft right now. The White House moving up, and the Democrats have come down, but will they come down a bit more so we can start getting people out of the water and onto the life raft? And if the Democrats don't, do they risk the accusation that in this political chess game, their side may be pinned with making Americans look like the pawns here?
On the last part, I'm just a policy guy. I will say I agree with your terminology that this is not regular stimulus. This is rescue and life raft kind of money until we get control of the virus. If you can get control of the virus, then we can get out of the business of keeping everyone afloat. But until you get control of the virus, we're in the business of supporting people so they don't get evicted. We don't have permanent damage. The details that Steve just told you, those aren't even in the negotiation. They're not talking about payroll tax cuts and details like that. And I think the root of the problem here is that if it were up to Mnuchin and Nancy Pelosi, they would have already had a deal. I mean, they've come down from the original positions, and they're very close in the grand scheme of things. The root problem is that the White House does not control Mitch McConnell. And Mitch McConnell has made clear that the Senate is not going to support anything like the terms of the quote unquote agreement that they would reach. And the Democrats in Congress know that. And so they're not inclined to do a bunch of public negotiating against themselves with the White House when the White House can't deliver its own votes.
Steve, Mitch McConnell just said in the last 12 hours, same thing. So how do you handle this? And suddenly his members of the Senate, the GOP members, have found, you know, fiscal religion here and conservative moves on money after such unbelievable spending. And I'm talking about pre-COVID. So how does this thing get harnessed and under control? And where does the president need to show some leadership?
Well, I think if he's showing leadership now and making it clear that he's willing to do an agreement on a huge package. And the key thing is the details. What the Republicans don't want are disguised bailouts of things like the post office, disguised bailouts of states that have mismanaged their finances. You clean that stuff out and you can get an agreement very quickly. And McConnell would go along with it. There are always going to be a handful of Republicans or Democrats who aren't going to vote for a final package. But if the two sides agree, I guarantee you'd get overwhelming support in both the House and the Senate, because people know, certainly the elected representatives know, if they can go home and say, here, we've done something. I think Austin's right in the sense that these are life rafts. This is like money to people who have been hit by a storm, an economic storm, healthcare storm. You would get overwhelming support. And people want to go home, including Congress, and say, here's what we've done. So I don't blame it on Mitch McConnell. I'm not sure Nancy Pelosi really wants a package that could be seen as something in any way helping Donald Trump. They can come to an agreement pretty quickly if they leave out the junk.
Answer that, Austan. What about that?
Look, Mitch McConnell's making clear he doesn't agree with Steve. I bet if Steve were in the negotiation, he would come to some reasonable compromise. Mitch McConnell is not bound by what is popular with the American people. I think Steve is right. The American people support the life raft. But if you look, for example, at the Trump tax cut that was supported unanimously by the Republicans, it's the most unpopular tax cut in the history of American polling. Even before COVID, only 34% of the American people agreed that it was a good idea. So the fact that the American people want something is definitely not that big of a motivator for Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans.
If you ask the American people if they want a $2,000 tax increase by losing the double of the exemption that tax cut gave them in 2018, I think most people would say, let me keep more of what I earn. They don't want to give up that money, and that's why they want another round of individual checks to help get their finances back in order from this disaster.
I agree. They do want the checks and that the economy does need the support. I will observe that the Biden plan does not raise anyone's taxes who makes less than $400,000 a year. So the only people complaining that they don't want their taxes to go up are the very people who have done quite well, not only in the last several years or decades, but have done well through this COVID crisis. And it's ordinary working people who are the ones who have been suffering. And that's why I hope that they're able to reach some kind of agreement.
Okay.
But we got to get over the McConnell hump.
I think that,
I don't see how you get past that.
Here's what we have to get over: the spending hump. President Trump has spent quite a bit of money expecting that his tax cuts would pay for themselves. Big tax cut for corporations. That has not yet come to pass. Steve, to Austan, though, we just showed the Biden plan. There's a deficit. Yes, you are implementing tax hikes on the so-called wealthy, although some would argue 400,000 is not wealthy depending on certain areas. But the spending is still outpacing the tax numbers that would come in. How do we then make the case that somehow Biden is going to bring down the deficit?
Well, I would say two things about that. I think you're conflating two different types of spending. One are emergency spending measures that are about the here and now and dealing with the ramifications of COVID. He has said, and almost all experts agree with, that should not be financed by current taxation. That should be deficit finance. For his longer run programs, it's not true. His longer run programs, he pays for by taxes that are not popular with Steve or with Mitch McConnell, but they are higher taxes on high income people, which is overwhelmingly supported by the American people in the polling.
Okay. So does Joe Biden want to continue the part of the Trump tax cut that doubled the exemptions for families? Why doesn't he come out and say that part of the Trump tax plan we will keep? Why doesn't he just say it explicitly?
He has. It's on his webpage.
He dodged it in the debate, and so did Kamala Harris.
Not true. It's right on the fact sheet that they will repeal the Trump tax cuts for people earning more than $400,000 a year for large corporations.
And when you take capital out of the economy, you're going to get a weak economy. We've tried that before, and it does not work. So hold on, people.
All right. So I tried to be fair and balanced. We started with Steve. We kind of ended with Austan. Good, vibrant discussion, gentlemen. We really appreciate it. We'll bring you both back because our economic undercard has been really popular with viewers.